Picture a mud brick balanced on a man's bitumen-dark forearm. Ur spreading below in every direction, the Euphrates a brown line to the south, heat lifting off baked courses beneath his sandals, the whole plain reduced to a low hum at this height. He sets it down. The bitumen in the creases of his knuckles has dried black, and his hands are so worked into the brickwork that the distinction between the man and the building is, at this point, one of temperature. Brick cools at night. He does not. He is not thinking about the man who ordered this platform built, or whose city this is, or what the finished structure will mean when the last course is set. He is thinking about water. Whoever was supposed to carry the skin up this morning did not come. Then the foreman comes, carrying a clay docket with course counts pressed into it, and he does not look at the horizon. He looks at the tally. He reads the number aloud in a flat voice. The laborer does not answer. He is still thinking about water. There is a slight sway at this height that the foreman, eyes on the clay, does not feel. The laborer feels it every time the wind comes off the river. The top of the world moves under his feet. He has learned not to mention it. A governor claimed a city, and a city claimed the world. The plain between the rivers is so flat that a man standing at its edge sees no horizon he did not put there. Ur sits near the mouth of the Euphrates, where the river slows and the trade routes from the sea and the mountains converge. For a generation before this ziggurat was laid, the cities of the southern plain had lived under a people called the Gutians, who came from the mountains to the east and held the trade routes without improving them. The temples still stood, the records were kept, but something was draining. A king of the city of Uruk named Utu-Hagal drove them out, and the plain was Sumerian again, and the records and tallies resumed their full authority. And the man Utu-Hagal had placed in charge of Ur as his governor began, quietly, to count what he himself now held. His name was Ur-Nammu. He had served loyally, managed the city's revenues and granaries, kept the records the new king required, done what governors do. Then Utu-Hagal died, and the question of who held Sumer came back to the man already holding its oldest city. He took a title no king before him had used in quite that form, King of Sumer and Akkad. A name wide enough to claim the whole southern plain, the oldest cities and the newer ones both, the rivers and the sea road and everything the records could reach. A title is a claim. A claim requires a center. And a center in the Sumerian understanding meant a city whose presence on the flat earth was undeniable enough that other cities would not dispute it. Ur already had the god of the moon. It needed the mountain. Sumer occupied the southernmost reaches of the plain, the alluvial land between the rivers. Akkad lay to the north, a different tradition, cities that had long been rivals. Ur-Nammu's title claimed both, a single name stretched across the full length of the river valley. The base alone measured roughly 64 meters by 46, a footprint pressed onto the flat ground by nothing but reed survey lines and the authority of the man who ordered it. The inner core was unfired mud brick, the outer skin was fired and sealed in bitumen. There are no mountains in this part of the world, no hills, no natural rises, nothing the eye can travel to. What Ur-Nammu built was the one vertical thing on a plain that offered none, an elevation imposed on a landscape that had no business holding one. Every brick had to be made. Every brick had to be counted. Workers moved clay from the riverbanks, shaped it in wooden forms, dried it in the sun or fired it in kilns, carried it to the site and set it into the course the foreman's tally required. The first terrace rose, then the second. Then the third, smaller than the one below it, the structure narrowing as it climbed so the summit felt earned, a thing the eye had traveled to through work, the tallest thing that plain had ever held. Around the base, the precinct enclosed temples to Nana and to his consort, Ningal, and the moon god's house was not only the tower, but the whole enclosure, the courts and storerooms and chambers, the entire block of ground the city had set aside for something larger than itself. A city without a mountain had built one, and in building it declared something no document needed to say aloud, that this was the place from which the world would be measured, that the records kept here were the ones that mattered, that the count started here. Ur-Nammu died around 2095 BC, 17 years into the dynasty he had founded. The circumstances remain uncertain. A lament survives in the clay, fragmentary and damaged, and what it describes is a king whose death came before the gods had finished with him. The lament describes the gods failing to protect him, a king abandoned at the moment the fighting turned, left to die in a way no one who had built what he built should have had to die. The text is damaged, the ending is unclear. It may have been a battle, but the ziggurat still stood. The tally of its bricks was somewhere in the clay of the city, recorded against a name, pressed into the archive Ur kept of everything it touched. Order is not a guarantee. It is, as it turned out, the clearest possible record of itself. A king who cannot be everywhere writes the rules down. The city that rose by counting could not stop at counting bricks. Every bushel of barley weighed against a standard, every field measured, every debt pressed into clay. Eventually, someone would dispute the measure, and the question of who decided could not wait for the king. In the reign of Ur-Nammu, the city's reach had grown long enough that a man with a grievance might walk for weeks and still not leave the shadow of Ur's authority. The king had more subjects than hours in a day. His voice alone could not travel that far. His kingdom stretched north and south along the rivers to cities that would receive his orders carried by messenger across days of flat plain and summer heat, each governor a distant surrogate for a king they might rarely see. He is the king who raised the great ziggurat and brought the cities of the southern plain under a single name. But the thing that will survive him, carried in the hands of scribes yet unborn, is not the tower. It is an argument pressed into clay. Picture the scribe who receives this commission. He does not begin with a law. He begins with a claim that the gods of Ur have sanctioned this king, that the weak will not be given over to the strong, that the widow and the orphan have a name behind them now. The laws that follow are not expressions of justice in the abstract. They are the king's pronouncements, set in sequence like entries in a ledger, each one reducing a human dispute to a column, the offense, the remedy, the weight of silver to be paid. The injury laws did not demand a foot for a foot. They demanded silver, a price set down for what one body had done to another. That silver had to be measured. The code that regulated the dispute also standardized the weight used to settle it. A shekel was not a word, it was a specific quantity, agreed upon, pressed into the same system of measures that made the city run. The laws covered agriculture, disputes over fields, over water rights between neighbors. They covered marriage, the terms of its dissolution, what a man owed a woman he set aside. They covered slavery. They covered the body. Every domain of daily life had now acquired a written answer. A city complex enough to need written arbitration across that many domains is a city that has already outgrown the capacity of any single memory to contain it. The king could not remember every dispute. The clay could. The tablet goes to the governor. The governor reads the law. And now the king's judgment arrives in a city he is not standing in, carried by a messenger who has no authority of his own, only the authority of the words pressed by someone else's hand. This is what no standing army could accomplish. A soldier carries presence, and presence ends where the soldier's reach ends. A tablet carries something else. It carries the argument, and the argument, once written, does not need the man who made it to keep going. Approximately 57 laws survive, or pieces of them, preserved across copies made centuries after the original tablet had crumbled. The copies were made in a language already becoming old. Scribes who had never seen the city of Ur still pressed those laws into their own clay. What we have is not the original. No original survives. What we have are copies of copies, each one a deliberate act of transmission, a later scribe deciding these words still mattered. The king's law outlasted his dynasty by 3 centuries before Hammurabi thought to do the same. The prologue does not begin with the laws. It begins with a claim about who this king is and what has authorized him to rule. The protection of the widow and the orphan is not a right granted to them. It is evidence of legitimacy offered by the king. You were a farmer at the edge of the irrigation network, too far from Ur to appeal to a judge in person, and a stronger man has taken what was yours. You know what the law says. The tablet says so. Whether the tablet changes anything is a different question. The code is a gesture toward permanence at the exact moment when permanence is most desired, because a city that has grown this large, this intricate in its dependencies, is also a city newly aware of how many ways it could come apart. The king's name is written at the beginning. His authority is the reason the document exists. But the document has already, in its own structure, imagined something the king may not have intended, a rule that stands when the king does not. 3 centuries later, scribes in cities that had never been Sumerian would still be copying those laws, pressing them into new clay in a language already half forgotten. Whoever first set them down had wanted law to outlast the dispute. It outlasted the civilization. The copies are what we have, fragmentary, partial, each one breaking off mid-law where the clay broke and no second copy fills the gap. The full code exists nowhere, recovered from nowhere whole. What we possess are the pieces a later world thought worth keeping. Think of the scribe who pressed the first copy. He believed these words important enough to duplicate, important enough to store. He was right. What he could not have known was that the act of copying would outlast every reason the original was written. What a man inherits, he counts. What he counts, he keeps. The man who inherited it did not set out to build taller or march farther, not at first. He looked at what his father had assembled, the provinces, the storehouses, the governors reporting from cities he had never visited, and he saw something that would not let him rest. The sums did not agree. One city counted grain by the vessel of its own potters. Another used a standard carved from local stone a generation back. A third had let its measure drift by a margin no one had corrected. An empire built on surplus cannot run on 3 versions of the bushel. Shulgi, son of Ur-Nammu, would rule for close to half a century, longer than any king of his dynasty before or after, and the record of his reign is not hewn in stone, but pressed into clay, in quantities that still astonish. The empire his father had unified stretched from the delta marshes in the south, where the 2 rivers lost themselves in the sea, north through the green plain to the foothills of the Zagros, held not by walls, but by appointed men in a dozen provincial cities. He sent the governors something no general had delivered to them before: new weights, not orders to march, not demands for tribute, weights, each one formed to an exact standard, each one bearing the mark of the center, each one a quiet instruction that the old local measure was now simply wrong. A stone weight, palm-sized, smoothed and stamped with the seal of Ur, arrived in a provincial storehouse the way a question arrives, by courier, without ceremony, carrying its own answer. The old weight stayed on the shelf. The new one went on the scale. The counting began again. Then the calendar. Every city in the plain had its own month names, its festival dates drifting against its neighbors like boats on different currents. Shulgi imposed one standard on the whole empire. A tablet from Umma and a tablet from Ur now referred to the same day. That had never been true before. The frieze spread across hundreds of tablets, pressed into wet clay in city after city, from the delta to the foothills. The king's stone, the king's count. Somewhere in the first decade of his reign, Shulgi established a single depot near Nippur at a place called Puzrish Dagan, and from that point, every animal arriving from the provinces, every ox, every sheep, every goat destined for temple or table or slaughter, passed through its gates to be counted before it went anywhere else. Picture the road into Puzrish Dagan at tribute season. Dust rising from the south track, a herder's crook above the reeds, the sound of animals arriving in their thousands, and at the gate, Always a man with a stylus and a tablet, writing the number before the gate opened. The animals that came in were tallied, the animals that went out were tallied. The surplus and the deficit were noted. The man who received more than he sent had to explain himself on clay. The man whose totals balanced walked away clean. The center knew the difference. In the same years, the scribal tablet house, the Eruba, was reorganized and expanded into something closer to an institution. Boys came in knowing nothing. They left knowing how to form every sign the administration required, how to structure a loan document, how to write the names of all the fish in the sea. A student sat with a tablet of fresh clay and copied what his teacher pressed in front of him. Numbers first, always numbers. The count of the barley measure, the capacity of the jar, the weight of the lump of silver, because these were the things the empire needed its scribes to know perfectly. In the northeast, where the plain gave way to the first ridges of the Zagros, Shulgi sent armies into the foothills repeatedly, not to absorb the mountain kingdoms, but to push them back and hold the edge of his counted world against what lay beyond. The men he placed in the border cities were loyal, and they knew what loyalty meant under this king: balanced tablets. A governor whose accounts did not reconcile to the center's records was not simply mistaken. He was a problem the king would eventually arrive to correct. Every year, the governors submitted their accounts, not summaries, not impressions, balanced accounts, commodity by commodity, showing every unit received against every unit dispatched, and the two totals were expected to agree. If they did not, the discrepancy existed in clay, and clay did not forget. Consider what this meant in practice. The moment every province measures grain the same way, counts animals the same way, dates its tablets by the same calendar, the center can know, in theory, everything that enters and leaves the system. Every bushel, every beast, every debt outstanding. In the ruins of Puzrish Dagon alone, scholars have recovered tens of thousands of tablets, not from the whole of the empire, from one depot, a single redistribution point. The scale of what Shulgi built was not grand in the way of temples or towers, it was grand in the way of paperwork. There is something to notice about a kingdom this precisely ordered. A system that documents everything entering the granary also documents everything leaving it. A system that tracks every deficit also preserves that deficit in clay, intact, long after the deficit becomes something harder to recover from. 48 years of this king, the longest of any Ur-3 ruler, and the counting never stopped. He standardized the weights, standardized the calendar, built schools to produce more scribes, and held the borders so the numbers kept flowing back to Ur. Shulgi did not just rule an empire, he measured it. The empire his system described was, by every indicator his tablets could provide, functioning. The green was moving, the animals were counted, the weights agreed. What a machine to have built, and what a record to have left behind. You will want to remember that in what comes next. The empire that counted everything counted its king among the gods. Somewhere in the administrative cities of the plain, a scribe is working through the morning's accounts, a list of offerings destined for the temple of Nana, silver and grain and animals pressed into columns on wet clay, each entry exact, each weight verified. The list needs a name at the top. The name is Shulgi. He has ruled for a generation already, long enough that children born when he took the throne have grown into the scribes who now work his counting houses. His empire is the largest and most organized thing on the plain between the rivers. He inherited the ziggurat already finished, the road stations already manned, the scribal archives already full. The empire Ur-Nammu built was handed to him like a tool already honed. The question every inheritor confronts is the same, not how to build the thing, but how to become it. Before his name on the official documents, the scribes now pressed a small wedge sign, the divine determinative, a single mark that meant, in the grammar of cuneiform, that the word it preceded belongs to a different category of being. Not man, not king alone, God. No earlier Ur-3 king had taken that step. Even the great builder of Ur's platform had not pressed that sign before his name. Shulgi pressed it, and the machinery of the empire wrote it into every record without comment, because the machinery of the empire wrote everything. Then came the hymns. 4 formal compositions survive into our own time, copied by scribal students onto practice tablets generations after Shulgi's death, worn into the curriculum alongside the verb lists and the multiplication tables. They were written to celebrate a living king. They did not do so quietly. He was, the hymns declared, a man trained in the tablet house, fluent in Sumerian and Akkadian, a scholar who understood the marks of the scribe as well as the arts of war. No king before him had announced such a thing in public. He announced it in verse. And he was an athlete. The hymns describe a run from the city of Nippur south to Ur and then north again, a circuit of something near 200 kilometers performed in a single day as an act of piety to serve the festivals of both cities at once. Animate the plain between Nippur and Ur, flat alluvial land, the Euphrates threading south, the road between the 2 temple cities crossing open ground, a distance a messenger covered in hours, an army in days. What the hymn means by the distance is worth holding. The plain between those cities is flat and long and not covered in a day's running, not by a man. But Shulgi's hymn does not say he ran as a man. It records the feat as it records the festival, as fact. The offerings followed. In the administrative archives, among the monthly records of what went to which temple and in what measure, a new line appeared. Rations in silver and animals for the divine image of Shulgi entered alongside the allocations for Nana and Enlil. Not ceremonial, not the gesture of a court that has learned the right forms. The same clay dockets that verified the weight of silver given to the moon god's shrine verified the weight given to the king's image. The same weights, the same hands. In every province, the governor who held his appointment from Ur swore his oath not to Nana alone or Enlil alone. He swore by those names and by the divine name of Shulgi. To act against the king was, in the terms of the oath, to act against the gods. Consider what this did to the structure of loyalty. Every governor in the empire, every man who held land or garrison or granary at the king's pleasure was now bound not only by politics, but by the same weight of obligation that bound him to the temple. The royal daughters went out from Ur the way all instruments of empire go out, systematically. Each marriage to a provincial governor or a foreign chief extended the claim of the center one alliance further, and each alliance was written into the record the day the arrangement was made. He did not dismantle the machine he had inherited. He extended it inward, past the offices and the garrisons and the storehouses into the temple itself, until the king and the deity occupied the same line on the tablet, the same column in the monthly record. Consider what the system looked like from inside. Every receipt moved upward through a chain of accountable hands. Every hand answered to someone above it. And at the top of the chain was a man who had declared himself beyond accounting because there was nothing above a god. The record did not question this. The record was not built for questioning. It was built for precision. Every bushel of barley accounted for. Every official in his place, every oath administered, recorded, filed, a perfect system. And perfection is its own kind of blind spot. Outside the plain, in the mountains to the east and the desert to the west, the things the counting could not count were gathering. They would not be recorded until they arrived. And when they arrived, the archives would hold the clearest possible record of what the empire had been. For now, the empire held. Shulgi's name was on the tablets and in the temples. The road messengers carried his dispatches across the plain. The grain poured into the storehouses. The overseers tallied. The priests administered the offerings, and the accounting continued without pause. An empire's peak is the moment it is most fully itself. every mechanism working as intended, every record filed, every oath in force. The peak is also when the record begins its longest chapter, the chapter that comes after. The count was everything, and the count never stopped. The city that rose on unified labor now held itself together by something smaller and more insistent, a reed pressed into wet clay again and again in every province of the plain, until the pressing became the empire itself. In a depot near Nippur, the smell is dung and river mud and the faint warmth of animals crowded in a yard before dawn, and a man sits cross-legged on a reed mat with a lump of wet clay on his knee, and through the gate another animal comes. He does not look at the animal long. One sheep, from the account of a named official, received on this day of this month in this year. He presses the record into the clay with a stylus no longer than his finger. That is enough. From Drehem in the north to the river cities of the south, a network of depots and archives stretched across the plain, each feeding its tallies upward to Ur, the palace at the center that the counting was designed to serve. The depot at Drehem was a clearinghouse for animals moving across the whole empire, cattle and sheep and goats and donkeys and pigs flowing in from every province as dues and flowing out as temple offerings, diplomatic gifts and rations, every movement written before the gate opened. Tens of thousands of tablets have come out of that one place alone. One animal, one transaction, one name attached to the record. No detail was considered too small to fix in clay, and so no animal passed through that gate as if it had never existed. Every tablet in the archive reads something like this: a commodity, a name, a date. No sentiment, no context. The animal exists because someone wrote it down. When enough tablets accumulated, someone tied them with cord, pressed an identifying seal into a clay tag, and sent the bundle south toward Ur. The journey could take days. The tablet arrived before the animal it described was a memory. In Ur, a clerk received the bundle, checked the seal against the tag, and set the tablets on a shelf. There were many shelves. There would be more. The shelf that fills is the most honest monument the empire ever built. In Umma, the subject was grain, how much the fields had yielded, how much had moved to the palace stores, and how much remained in the provincial granary. The Euphrates plain was among the most fertile land in the world, and every bushel of it was spoken for before the harvest was in. In Girsu and Lagash, the scribes kept different accounts: which man had worked which field on which day, what land obligation he was fulfilling, how many days he had given and how many he still owed, and what commodity he had received in return. Every laborer in the system was known by name. The record noted how many days he had worked and what he received in barley, in fish oil, and wool. The ration issued was simultaneously a work record and a payment receipt. The clay held the whole transaction in a space the size of a palm. A man could receive barley for 3 days of canal work and fish oil at the month's end. Each exchange was pressed into clay and filed. He may not have known that his name was on a shelf in a room he would never enter. Someone did. At the end of each year, provincial governors were required to submit a balanced account, every commodity received set against every commodity dispatched, with any shortfall explained in writing or repaid in kind. The palace did not accept a silence in place of a number. If the numbers did not agree, the disagreement had to be named and resolved. The system assumed that anything unwritten had not happened, and anything written could not be denied. A governor who could not close his account had a problem with the clay before he had a problem with the king. Without the tablet, no governor could prove he had done his duty, and no palace could verify that it was still in command. The clay was not a record of the empire. It was the thing holding the empire together, province by province, shelf by shelf. The agreement at the heart of the system was simple and total. If the count is correct, then all is correct. A balanced account meant nothing was lost. The clay said so. And the clay was the only court in which that claim could be tested. The archive that has reached us runs to more than 100,000 tablets. That is only the portion that survived burial in dry soil that was dug out and identified. What crumbled or was never found was surely larger. An empire pressed itself into existence one wedge at a time. The tablets do not record the smell of the depot or the weight of the stylus after a long mourning, or whether the counter knew the animal by sight. They record only what was agreed to matter. Everything else, in the logic of the archive, did not exist. Somewhere in those shelves, there are the first signs of what is coming. The governor's balanced accounts grow later in their delivery, the numbers thin in certain provinces. A tally submitted 2 months past its time is still, technically, a balanced tally. The system accepts it. The empire will not end in a battle that anyone planned for. It will end in a tally no one is able to close, in provinces that stop sending their accounts because there is no longer a palace to receive them. The archive of everything is also the archive of how everything ends. 2 currencies run this empire, barley and the favor of the moon. She is in the gig par when the moon clears the horizon. The air at the high window shifts the way it always does at this hour, a weight added to the light that is almost palpable, and she does not name it, but she knows it. She sets out the vessels. The vessels have been prepared to a sequence older than anyone in the city can name. Oil measured, grain measured, the animals chosen from herds kept for this purpose, their selection recorded on tablets filed in the archive. The offering itself, what she does in the lamplight, is not recorded anywhere. Her title is Priestess of Nana. There is no higher religious office in Ur. What she is to the moon god and the understanding of every person in the city below is wife, the earthly wife of a god who governs the sky. She holds this office for life. The Gigpar stands inside the sacred precinct at Ur's heart, walled from the lower city, beside Nana's great temple and the ziggurat that rises above everything, the canals threading southward toward the Euphrates, the plain extending flat and dark in every direction under the night sky. Nana governs time. The new moon opens the month, the full moon marks its midpoint, and the cycles of labor, offering, and taxation that run this empire are calibrated against that same sky she watches from the roof. The god is not a symbol here. He is the calendar. In the ordering this city has inherited, Nana stands above Utu, the sun god, whose city is Sipar, and above Inanna, goddess of love and war, whose city is Uruk. The moon is father of the sun. Ur is, in this reckoning, the senior city in the world. Her name does not survive in the tablets with any certainty. Her office does. She appears in administrative registers as a function of the state, her duties and their requirements noted with the same deliberate care applied to a levy of livestock or a shipment of timber. There was a tradition, old even by Ur III standards, of appointing a king's daughter to this office. When Sargon's empire had ruled these cities in the generations before, his daughter had held the role at Ur. Whether the Ur III kings continued the practice in the same form, the record does not say plainly. What the record says plainly is this: the moon requires feeding. At the new moon and the full moon, specific animals and quantities of grain are due to Nana's temple. They are not gifts, they are scheduled disbursements, entered in the archive at Puzerstagen beside the governor's barley. She is the highest person in the sacred precinct and the most precisely documented. The state knows what she is owed and what she owes back. It knows the dimensions of her residence. What the state cannot file is what she carries when she crosses the threshold at moonrise. On festival days, Nana's sacred boat was brought out onto the canals that threaded through the lower city, the god's cult statue installed on its deck, the procession moving slowly past lines of people standing on the banks. The offerings required to make this possible had been counted and filed months before. Think about what the state has done here. It has taken the movement of a god's image through a city's waterways and entered it into a ledger. It has made devotion into logistics. And it has done this not to diminish the god, but because it sees no separation between the two. The empire runs on 2 currencies at the same time: barley and silver on one side, divine favor on the other. The scribes log both, the governors report on both. When the new moon rises over Ur, it is a debt payment date as surely as any grain consignment from the south. The grain deficit, if it goes unfiled, leaves a blank in the record that any inspector can find. What the end priestess performs in the gigpar tonight cannot go blank in the same way, cannot be audited by any foreman with a docket of course counts. And yet the state treats both as real. There is a word for what the scribes cannot enter in the tablets: nothing. They have no notation for the offering that passes between a woman and a god in a lamplit room. They have categories for every animal, every measure of oil, every yard of linen. The ceremony itself falls outside the columns.
Nearly 4,000 years later, an archaeologist named Woolley will dig the gigpar out of the sand. The walls still standing in places, the ground plan plain enough to read. He will find evidence of the rooms, the storage areas, the structure of an official residence. He will not find the moment in the lamplight. The record stops at the threshold. The empire that filed everything, that tracked every ox and every basket of fish sauce, that reduced the harvest of a civilization to notations on wet clay, could not reach into this room. The most precise state in the ancient world had a gap it never tried to close. She finishes. The moon is past its highest point now and beginning the long descent toward the western plain. She sets the last vessel down with the same care she used to take up the first. The offering is complete. No one will file a report on what just happened. Below her, in the lower city, the grain archive is dark and sealed. The tablets stacked in their rows hold the count of every bushel received and dispersed this season, every herd animal allocated, every ration issued. It is perfect. It is complete, and not one line of it touches what she has just done. The Ur-3 Empire knows this. It has built the gigpar beside the archive on purpose. It has made the end priestess an officer of the state for a reason. It believes, without reservation, that the moon god's satisfaction is as necessary to the city's survival as barley in the storehouse. Both ledgers must balance. The city below does not sleep entirely. A watchman on the wall is looking at the same moon she has been tending. He does not know her name. He knows the moon governs the month, that the next offering date is logged in the archive, and that the city stands because both things are true. An empire that counted everything now counts the days between raids. The horizon a man put there did not hold forever. Amar Sin received what his fathers had built: the accounts, the granaries, the provinces, the hymns already pressed in clay. He stepped into a machine his grandfather had designed and his father had perfected. The machine ran.
The couriers still arrived. The tablets still accumulated in the archive rooms at Nippur, at Ur, at Puzurish Dagon. Tally after tally pressed into wet clay and baked and stocked. The empire's pulse recorded in grain rations and head counts and the movement of oxen across the plain. But out on the western margins, something was moving that did not appear in the tallies. The Marchu came from the steppe and the Syrian desert, from the long dry places where the rivers did not reach, and they did not stay long enough to be counted. The empire's settled heartland ran between the Euphrates and the Tigris, a cultivated corridor of walled cities and irrigated fields. Beyond its western edge, the steppe opened into distances the provincial clerks had no words for, and the Marchu moved through those distances at will. They kept animals more than they planted fields. They moved with the grazing, following the seasonal grass across land the Sumerians had never tried to administer, because there was nothing there to administer. No walls, no storehouses, no archives, no fixed address at which a census could arrive. The Sumerian state had a procedure for everything it could name. It had ration lists for laborers and docket systems for oxen and royal inspectors for granaries.
When its northern garrisons began requesting more soldiers, the requests went into the record system and moved through channels in the correct order. The requests came back from exposed posts, more soldiers, relief for the garrisons. Administrators who had run provincial offices in the north began to move inward, closer to the cities, closer to the archives, closer to walls that had already been built. The counting went on. The distances grew. Shu-Sin came to the throne with the inheritance his brother had received, the accounts, the armies, the hymns of praise. By every measure the records could provide, he was a king in the tradition of his fathers. He had a problem the records could not solve. He ordered a wall built across the steppe, not one wall perhaps, but a series of defensive works stretching across the land the Martu were using to approach the settled country. The tablets called it the wall that keeps out the Tidnum. The Tidnum were the Martu.
The texts named it plainly. No metaphor, no monument to a god. A wall for keeping people out. The wall's precise course is not known with certainty. It ran somewhere north and west of the heartland cities, across ground the settled farmers had never claimed, a line drawn in mud and labor between the worlds that kept records and the worlds that did not. Men carried the clay and mixed the bitumen and pressed the courses into position under the sun, just as they had on every other great project the kings had ordered, following the same docket system, the same course count tallies, the same foremen moving with clay tablets and flat voices. The Martu did not have walls. This was the point. They moved because the steppe rewarded movement, because the rains came and went and the grass followed the rains, and the animals followed the grass, and a people attached to any fixed point would eventually find that point exhausted. A scribe in Ur could enter a city's grain output and calculate the shortfall and dispatch the order. He could not enter the Martu into a ledger. They had no city, no storehouse, no fixed population. They were not legible to the system trying to stop them. The wall was built because the empire knew how to build things. It had been building for generations. Canals, granaries, ziggurats, the archive rooms at Nippur where the empire's memory lived in clay. A wall was something you could record in a tablet and inspect and account for. The Martu did not obligingly stop. The texts that document the wall's construction also document the soldiers still being dispatched, the administrators still moving closer to the heartland, the requests from the northern garrisons arriving with a regularity the archive system recorded in perfect order. The hymns continued through both reigns, Amar-Sin and then Shu-Sin, the ritual praise pressed into tablets and joined to the accumulating record, though neither king quite claimed for himself what their father had. The record still sang. The margins still moved. There is a particular kind of order that mistakes the account for the thing being accounted for. The empire knew to the last bushel how much grain was stored in each province. It knew less certainly, with every passing season, how much province it still held. Shu-Sin ruled for perhaps 8 years. His son would follow him, and the machine would pass forward again, tally and hymn and garrison and docket, right up to the moment it could no longer be passed. The wall that kept out the Tidnum stood somewhere on the steppe. Where exactly, the record does not say with confidence. The tablets speak of its construction with precision, the labor, the materials, the foremen, and their course counts. What the tablets do not preserve is the wall itself. The steppe kept no records. That was precisely the problem. An empire built on the certainty that everything real could be written down had met something it could not write down. The wall was the answer a counting mind gives to a question counting cannot answer. It is in the clay. Whether it held is another matter. The empire built on correspondence is about to be unmade by it. Ibbi-Sin inherited the throne and the seal and the whole apparatus of a kingdom that had kept its accounts in clay for a century. He was the 5th king of Ur's great dynasty. He would be the last. The records did not tell him that. They never do while it is happening. The south was dry. The granaries of Ur were not keeping pace with the city's demands, and Ur had grown vast on the surplus of a conquered plain, but that plain had limits the empire had never needed to find before. Now the city was pressing against them. To the north, the cities of Isin and Kazalu held richer grain stores, further from the drying floodplain. The empire reached them still.
The road south was long, and it ran through open country, the kind a mobile force with no fixed address could close at will. So he sent a man north. Ishbi-Era held a position in the Ur administration, a man of enough standing to negotiate on the throne's behalf, carrying the royal commission and authority to purchase what the city needed. He went north with the seal. That was the arrangement. What Ishbi-Era found in the northern markets was not what the commission had anticipated. The price of grain at Isen had risen so far above any reasonable expectation that the original plan, buy what Ur needed and bring it south, was already failing before the first sock was loaded. And then the roads. Amorite groups were moving through the territory between the northern cities and Ur, mobile and difficult to predict, closing the route south in a way no convoy commander could safely ignore. Ishbi-Era wrote to the king. He laid out the situation. He asked for instructions. The letter arrived in Ur in the proper form. The polite salutation, the careful address, the formulaic deference a subordinate owed a king. And then the request, placed near the center of the clay, calm as an accounting entry. Allow me to hold the grain at Isen. The road south is not safe. Ibbi-Sin read the request. He had administered an empire by letter for years. He understood the structure of what he was being asked. The grain was in Ishbi-Era's custody. The roads were genuinely dangerous. The request was reasonable. And the request was the moment everything changed. Every word of the exchange was pressed into wet clay with a reed. The same clay, the same reeds, the same polite conventions that had governed the empire's administration for a century. The same instrument that had built Ur's authority was now the instrument being used to quietly disassemble it. Picture Ishbi-Era at Isen, the green in the storehouses behind him, the city walls close, the royal commission still technically in his hand. He was not yet a rebel in any name the correspondence would use. He was an official with a problem. The problem was also an opportunity.
More letters went south. Each one opened with the proper forms of deference, each one closed with assurances, and each one found a new difficulty that placed the grain's return just beyond what the current situation permitted. Ibbi-Sin read each one in Ur. He wrote back. The exchange continued. What a king writes when he understands what is happening but cannot yet name it is a particular kind of document. Ibbi-Sin's replies grew more insistent in their requests, more rigid in their titles, as if the formality of the address could summon the compliance the distance was eroding. Neither man named it. The letters kept their conventions, their careful titles, their systems of mutual acknowledgement. A man holding a city's grain behind its walls, writing south about road conditions, was no longer a subordinate in any sense that mattered. The correspondence did not say so. It kept its forms. The territory that answered to Ur did not fall in one moment. It contracted from the edges inward. Northern cities that once sent tribute now sent letters. The roads that had carried grain and soldiers now carried only words, and the words were growing evasive. The grain Ibbi-Sin had sent Ishbi-Era to procure would have eased his city through a lean season. It remained in Isin's storehouses while the shortages in Ur deepened. The mission had been precisely documented, the quantities required, the cities named, the authority granted. The documentation survived. The grain did not come. Years passed this way. A decade of letters, each formally opened, each finding a new reason why compliance was not yet possible. The machinery of communication that had bound the empire together continued to function. The empire it was supposed to bind was no longer there to receive its messages. Around 2017 BC, the pretense resolved itself. Ishbi-Era declared himself king of Isin and founded a dynasty. He kept the grain. The man Ibbi-Sin had dispatched north with a commission and the authority of the throne came back in correspondence as a king in his own name.
The empire that had built its power on written records left a record of its own unraveling that nothing could obscure. The letters survived, copied into later tablets centuries after the events they described, preserved because they were considered worth keeping. A dynasty's collapse, commission by unreturned commission. There is no mystery in what happened, no missing archive, no gap the historians must argue across. Ibbi-Sin wrote,
Ishbi-Era replied, "The dissolution of the last great Sumerian dynasty is among the most legible disasters of its age. You can read it in sequence. You can watch it happen." The scribes who pressed those letters into clay were doing exactly what the empire had trained them to do: record everything, let nothing pass unnoted. They built a system so thorough that when it began to fail, it recorded the failure with the same precision it brought to the counting. What happened to Ur itself is still coming. The city that had stood at the center of the world was losing the grain and the loyalty that had kept it there. Ibbi-Sin still held the title. The letters still went out in his name. Very little else remained. An empire that lives by its records must one day stop writing. The man who sits at the receiving table in the archive room has been at it long enough that he knows the weight of a tablet before he reads it. He sets the new arrival down, checks the sender's mark, and reaches for his stylus. Behind him, the shelves run floor to ceiling in courses of mud brick and shadow, each slot carrying its clay burden. Ration lists, grain deliveries, cattle tallies, worker counts. For nearly 100 years, this room had been filling, and every filled slot was an empire functioning as designed. He knows the rhythm of the provincial correspondence the way a miller knows the sound of the wheel. The dispatches from each city arriving at its expected interval, the balance checked, the tablet filed, another week accounted for, and the record permanent.
Then the batch from Ishbi-Era does not come. The scribe makes a note. He has made notes about late arrivals before. The system has protocols for this, because the system was built by people who believed that if a thing were written down, it could not get away. From the city of Ur, the administrative network had once extended across the whole southern plain, each provincial city a node in a system that sent commodities in one direction and counted them in both. The nodes, one by one, went dark. Eshnunna stopped sending its accounts, then Lagash, then Umma, cities that had filed their balance tallies without interruption across the long reign of a dynasty now simply did not file them. The silence was not sudden. It accumulated the way dust accumulates on a shelf no one uses. What Ibbi-Sin received in place of the regular provincial dispatches was a kind of administrative quiet that had no precedent in the system's own records. The system had been designed to record everything. It had recorded, without knowing it, the moment it began to fail. Ibbi-Sin, last king of the Third Dynasty of Ur, ruling from a city whose empire was unwinding faster than he could document the unwinding. He is still writing letters. The empire was built to write, and he is the last one in it still sending. The letters Ibbi-Sin wrote went north and received no answers, or they received answers so limited, so hedged, that they amounted to the same thing. A king addressing subjects who no longer considered themselves subject is not sending dispatches, he is writing into a silence. Beyond the walls of Ur, the agricultural land that had fed the city and the empire for generations was being crossed and occupied by Amorite groups moving through the surrounding plain. The granaries could not be stocked from fields the caravans could not reach. The territory answering to Ur's king contracted steadily through the years after 2010 BC, pulled inward like water leaving a shoreline, until the correspondence, the grain, and the political loyalty of the whole dynasty had concentrated into a single city on the plain.
The grain prices recorded in the surviving correspondence from this period tell their own story. The cost of barley spiked in a way the system's own tablets document with the same flat administrative precision they had always used, as though recording a catastrophe were no different from recording a delivery. The ration distribution records, which had run without interruption for nearly a century, listing the daily allocations to workers and dependents across Ur's many institutions, began to break off. Not with a final entry that declared itself final, they simply stopped. The balanced account system required commodities flowing in from the provinces before it could balance anything. When the provinces stopped sending, the scribes in the archive rooms had nothing to weigh against the outgoing allocations. The system did not collapse, it simply had nothing left to do. Picture the shelves in the archive rooms around 2010 to 2005 BC. They fill to a certain course and then stop. The tablets pressed into the lower slots are dense, regular, datable. Above a certain point, nothing. The shelf is there, the slot is there, the tablet is not. No one carved an announcement. No scribe pressed a final tablet declaring the archive closed. The silence on the shelf is the only declaration the system ever made about its own ending, and it is completely legible to anyone who knows how to read the absence of a thing. Sin's effective authority had by now contracted to the city itself, the streets his predecessors had built, the walls that still stood, the granaries now drawing on whatever stocks remained inside them, rather than on the continuous supply the empire had always assumed would come. The last firm administrative dates from the Ur-3 archive cluster around 2004 BC. Not because a scribe chose to stop, because that is the year the city fell, the year the Elamites came from the east, and the recording stopped not as a decision, but as a fact.
The city of Ur had been standing while its empire died. The walls, the ziggurat, the archive rooms with their loaded shelves, the institutions still maintaining their forms inside a territory reduced to the city's own shadow. The sack, when it came, did not end the empire. The empire had already ended. What the Elamites found when they arrived was not an empire defending itself. It was the administrative body of one. The form still present, the habit of record still present, the king still present, and nearly everything the king had once commanded already gone somewhere the tablets could not follow. The system that built the empire recorded the empire's end in the only language it knew. Not a battle, not a declaration, a gap in the shelf where the next batch of tablets should have arrived, and a chair in the receiving room that no courier came to fill. Ur kept the count until the count could not be kept. The walls of Ur still stood. The courses of brick still showed the count, still rose in the stepped mass that had been the tallest thing on the plain, but the garrison within them was thin, and the green in the temple storerooms had been found wanting for years. Somewhere inside the administrative district, a man was still pressing a stylus into wet clay. He had been pressing it into wet clay his whole working life. The column he was filling recorded rations for soldiers who may no longer have been at their posts. He filled it anyway. The Shemashki kings of Elam occupied the highland country east of the Tigris, watching the plain grow wealthy for centuries. The plain was no longer as strong as it looked. The forces that moved west are associated in what survives with a king named Kendatu. From a distance, Ur still read as the thing it had always been. The ziggurat catching the high sun above the flat plain, the walls running long and low, the whole profile of a city that does not expect to be tested. Walls do not show you what is behind them. They came from the east. The defenses that had held the perimeter of an empire for a century held nothing now. The city that had maintained garrisons across the length of the southern plain was reduced, at its moment of reckoning, to the walls around its own center. The storerooms behind the great court of the ziggurat held the city's accounts and its sacred stores in the same space. Oil counted by the jar, grain by the sela, dedication offerings logged in the same clay that logged the ration lists. When the doors broke, it all went together. The fires that marked the succession of rites in the great court had been maintained through a dozen generations. Someone had always carried the wood up. Someone had always kept the sequence. The fires went out. The sequence that had never been interrupted was interrupted. Sin had been king of Ur for nearly a quarter century when the city fell. Every year, the administrative tablets had brought him the record of another city that no longer answered, the web contracting province by province until only the city itself remained. He was taken alive. The man whose name had headed the year lists, whose seal had been pressed into clay across 100 offices, was carried east into Elam. He did not return. The dynasty ended not in a last stand, but in a procession going the wrong direction. The population of Ur scattered. into the plain, into the reed beds south of the city, onto the roads toward towns that were themselves diminished. The city's people dispersed the way any population disperses when the organizing structure is gone. They went where there was still water and a roof. Consider what is missing. The city that had produced more continuous administrative records than any place on the southern plain left no account of its own burning. The hands that had pressed the daily tallies into wet clay were not at their desks. There were no desks left. This is what the poet who composed the lament understood. Not why the walls fell, why the gods had already turned their faces.
The lament for the destruction of Ur was composed after the burning by someone who was not there. It was written in Sumerian, the language of the dynasty, which was already yielding to Akkadian in the mouths of the living. The loss was set down in a tongue already becoming past tense. The poem frames the disaster as a plea already answered. Ningal speaks before an assembly that has already decided. The decision cannot be reversed. What follows is not defeat in any sense a general would recognize. It is the working out of a decree ratified before the walls were tested. The lament describes the sacred precinct in the particular language of inventory, the great court, the storerooms, the ritual vessels, the fires. It is the city's own accounting habit turned toward elegy, the scribe's reflex surviving the city that had trained it. When Leonard Woolley dug at Ur in the 1920s and 30s, he found the signature of a city that had been ended rather than abandoned. A destruction layer, collapsed phases, the statographic mark of event. The earth had kept what no scribe had been there to write. After 2004 BC, no Sumerian-speaking dynasty held political authority over the southern plain again. The language persisted in the scribal schools, copied and taught and used in sacred contexts for centuries. But the power it had organized, the machine it had been the operating language of, was gone. Consider what the fire did not reach. The clay tablets of the Ur-3 administration survived the burning in the ground. Thousands of them, ration lists, labor tallies, sealed accounts from offices that had been ash for millennia. The counting had outlasted the counters. No scribe sat at a desk to record the last day. The most administered city on the plain left no contemporary account of its own end. The lament came later, written in a language already receding, asking not why the walls had failed, but why the gods had turned away. There is a logic to the question. A city organized by divine mandate that had built every year name and every legal formula on the favor of the divine assembly could only lose the world in the same terms it had claimed it. The record was perfect. It recorded everything, line by line, in clay that will not burn, does not fade, does not soften with time. It recorded the last year and the year that had no name. And then it stopped. The city fell. The language it was written in did not. Picture a boy in Nippur, perhaps 500 years after the last king of Ur was led away in chains, sitting in a tablet house with a fresh clay tablet before him and a stylus pressed between his fingers, forming signs in a language his mother never spoke. He is copying the lament for the destruction of Ur. Every sign must be correct. Every wedge pressed at the right angle. Every sign group reproducing exactly what the line above it shows, because a word copied wrong is worse than no word at all. He's not asked to understand it. Outside the tablet house, the city speaks Akkadian. His mother haggles in it at the grain market. His father uses it to argue, to pray, to tell his children what to do. The language on the tablet is from a world that ended before his grandfather's grandfather was born. He copies it anyway. This is the Edubah, the tablet house, and it has one principle that has not been revised. The language of learning is Sumerian, because it is the language the writes have always used, and the oldest inscriptions have always spoken, and the masters have not changed it.
When Ur fell, it left behind a landscape of surviving cities. Nippur to the north, Larsa and Isen rising to claim the south, all of them still building in the old tradition, still reading and writing in the old script. The kings who replaced the rulers of Ur were Akkadian speakers. They did not speak Sumerian at home, but they spoke it in their royal inscriptions. When they wanted to sound like power at its oldest and most legitimate, they reached for the dead tongue. A dead spoken language had become, by its very absence from ordinary use, the register of the weighty and the formal. The kings of Isin and Larsa ruled in Akkadian and wrote their dedications in Sumerian. The language nobody learned at their mother's knee was the language fit to address the deep past. The lament for the destruction of Ur cataloged the fall in exact detail. The walls breached, the temples emptied, the storehouses stripped, the ziggurat abandoned to wind and silence. It named what was lost in the order it was lost. It was grief rendered as inventory. The same tablet houses that kept the lament kept everything else. The epic of Gilgamesh, the hymns to Inanna, the school exercises, the word lists, the model contracts. Whatever Sumerian scribes had written, Sumerian scribes had copied, and whatever had been copied had a chance of surviving the next dynasty and the next. The boy in the tablet house does not know this yet. He knows the shape of the signs and that the master will check his work, and that a badly pressed wedge must be smoothed and pressed again. He does not know that he is part of the longest preservation effort in the ancient world. 500 more years pass, and then 500 more. Akkadian empires rise and fall. New rulers hold Mesopotamia. And in the temple courts, priests are still performing the old liturgical laments in Sumerian, the Belag and the Ersima, in a language the congregation cannot follow word for word. New liturgical pieces were still being composed in Sumerian, centuries after the fall of Ur, because the tradition demanded it. The form was ancient, the language was ancient, the audience did not understand the words. That was not a problem to solve, it was the condition of the right. By the time Alexander's successors hold Babylon around 300 years before the Common Era, Sumerian has not been spoken as a living tongue for over 15 centuries. The men performing the rites have learned the sounds by rote. The sounds are Sumerian. The understanding behind them is, at best, approximate.
Consider what that is. A language kept alive not by speakers, but by copyists, sustained not through conversation, but through schooling, performed in the rites by men who learned it sound by sound without speaking it at home, the way a craft is learned from a master who has never used it outside the workshop. The last cuneiform tablets with Sumerian content date to around the 1st century of the Common Era. By then, the city that raised the Great Ziggurat had been buried under its own rubble for 2,000 years. A language had outlasted the civilization that invented it by the span of Rome. 2,000 years. The language that first recorded the law, the complaint letter, the love poem, the receipt for barley, had long since stopped being anyone's mother tongue. And yet the scribe who pressed the final mark into clay was doing exactly what the scribes of Ur had done, keeping the record. Sumerian did not die with Ur, it was embalmed. Line by line, generation by generation, the language that built the first cities was preserved in the very medium it had invented for itself, clay, and the pressed mark that does not rot. The same impulse that once pressed a delivery of grain into clay had pressed the grief for a lost city into clay. The record keepers did not stop when the thing being recorded was the end of everything. They continued because that was what the system required. They were counting. They were always counting. The boy sets his stylus down. He smooths one poorly pressed sign and presses it again. The master nods. The tablet will dry, be checked, be filed. Somewhere in a room he has never entered, a copy of this same text already exists. His will make it more certain to last. The fall of Ur was written down so precisely that it could not be forgotten. 2,000 years of copyists, ritualists, and students in tablet houses saw to that. The record did not prevent the ending, it outlasted it. If this found you, like, subscribe, and follow Border Prompt. More civilizations, more questions, more stories that refuse to stay buried.